Explanation of the process of dependent origination by Venerable Rungruang Papassaro, Dr. Rungruang Limchoopatipa. On the day of the Buddha's enlightenment, the Buddha investigated the mind and its functions in detail. By establishing mindfulness and performing an insight observation, the Buddha saw individual mental phenomena such as death, birth, existence, clinging, craving, feeling, contact, the six sense bases, name and form, consciousness, and volitional formations. These mental phenomena were changing at all times, so they were impermanent. Also, they arose and faded away, so they were deteriorating, and all of them were caused by certain causes and effects in nature, so they were no self. After that, he expanded the investigation to see the relationship among them. He discovered the process of dependent origination that led to suffering in life. That is, all of these mental phenomena were processing in a certain formation due to their condition and consequence, forming a process of dependent origination. And after realizing this process of dependent origination, the Buddha applied the Four Noble Truth analysis on each state of the process of dependent origination, and he had discovered this path to enlightenment and concluded that the root causes of the problem were from craving, clinging, and ignorance on the insight. The Buddha compared this discovery to a person finding an ancient city, and the Eight Noble Paths, that is, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, as the path and way to resolve the problem, respectively. A cycle of the process of dependent origination is considered as one completion of changing from one state formation to another state formation in one cycle of the birth and death of the object of consciousness. The interval time from birth aging to death of the object of consciousness generates a single frame of perception, and after the volitional formations, the mind will generate the next new frame of perception. While the mind processes a new signal of an object of consciousness in each frame of perception one by one, each frame flips from one frame to another so fast that the continuation of each frame in perception constitutes the persistence of perception, making the continuous movements of the processing story in perception. As a matter of fact, only a few portions of information from the world are inputs into the mind, while most of the information is provided by internal volition formations in the process of dependent origination. The mind continues in the process of dependent origination in many cycles. The finest defilement becomes more complex, starting the dysfunction of mind processing from the identity to be someone by assuming a self to be engaged with the object of consciousness, then causing the dysfunction of mind in the first round of the process of dependent origination with desire and lust. After that, the whole mind processing is dominated by such a self in the five aggregates subject to self, and then the mind keeps on generating a new object of consciousness in association with a self with desire and lust. As new signals are constantly formulated and transmitted throughout the central nervous system, we unnoticeably are creating an imaginary world of an individual centered on a self of being. This imaginary world seamlessly entangles with the physical world of reality. Whatever is happening in the world is real, but it is no self. The Buddha explained that because of the identity as someone as a self to be engaged with the object of consciousness with desire and lust, the mind was banished from the reality that, in fact, such an object of consciousness had already faded away by nature, but the mind kept on engaging with the matter by generating a new similar object of consciousness to proceed with the process of dependent origination with ignorance. In fact, the object of consciousness has already risen and faded away at the end of each round of the process of dependent origination. However, because of the combination of the taint of sensual desire with desire and lust, the taint of existence for a self of being, and the taint of ignorance to the reality that the object of consciousness is already faded away, the mind internally generates a new signal in volitional formations to resume the mind processing by pushing into a new round of the process of dependent origination. Then mental feeling push forward along the next round of the process of dependent origination. As the object of consciousness arises and fades away, then due to the ignorance, the mind generated a new internal object of consciousness in volitional formations, and then the mind continues pushing into a next round of the process of dependent origination. As this process of dependent origination proceeds in this fashion for many rounds, the internal object of consciousness becomes more and more complex, turning the mind to unwholesome thoughts of the five lower fetters, namely sensual desire with obsession, ill will with compulsive disorder, depression, anxiety, and doubt. The Buddha explained what was happening in the process of dependent origination in the first round as the pre-processing of the origin of thinking. In this circumstance, taints in the process of dependent origination are considered the finest defilements, which are the origin of the whole mess of suffering. Typically, after the volitional formations in the first round of the process of dependent origination, once an internal object of consciousness is generated, the mind sinks into the virtual reality of our own imagination, in which the mind is dominated by the combination of taints in the mind processing. For example, if the mind is dominated by the taint of sensual desire, then the mind will respond with mental feeling emotionally, and then the mind will proceed in many rounds of the process of dependent origination, becoming dominated by unwholesome thought, a sort of obsession and compulsive disorder. In the case where the mind is dominated by the taint of existence, then the mind will respond to an internal object of consciousness with a mental feeling centering on the identity to be a self of being to be involved with the matter in the unwholesome thought in the past or the future, and the mind will proceed in many rounds of the process of dependent origination, becoming unwholesome thought, a sort of depression or anxiety. In the case where the mind is dominated by the taint of ignorance, then the mind will become doubtful and not know what to do. As the mind keeps on processing the problems in this manner, the unwholesome thought becomes more complex and serious with emotion, and then the mind turns out to become emotional with greed, hatred, and delusion before bursting out in evil doing. On the day of enlightenment, the Buddha discovered that all suffering and problems in life are caused by the process of dependent origination aggravating defilements inside the mind. Therefore, the path and way to make an end of suffering is to break and terminate the cycle of the process of dependent origination by performing the Buddhist practice to liberate the mind from craving, clinging, and ignorance of the process of dependent origination. That is, by establishing mindfulness to abandon unwholesome thoughts, then the mind is glad, and then, dependent on gladness, rapture arises. Dependent on rapture, bodily and mind seclusions arise. Dependent on bodily and mind seclusions, happiness arises. Dependent on happiness, the right concentration arises. Dependent on the right concentration, insight arises. Dependent on insight, the knowledge of the process of dependent origination arises. And then, by applying the Four Noble Truths to each mental phenomenon to analyze the whole system of the process of dependent origination. Dependent on the application of Four Noble Truths on the process of dependent origination, the knowledge for the destruction of the taints arises. This is the path and way to enlightenment to gain the knowledge of the destruction of the taints. Clearly, we still have bodily feelings associated with the world. However, the bottom line is the issue of how to deal with it rightly, not to be obsessed with it no matter if it is a pleasant feeling or an unpleasant feeling. This is where the mindfulness to realize that life is just a natural process, not a self, comes to safeguard the mind from desire and lust. In this circumstance, the mind becomes disenchanted and becomes dispassionate to the world. Through the dispassion, there is no self to be associated with any internal object of consciousness, and as a result, there is no more internal generating of the object of consciousness, and there is no more mental feeling. Then the mind is liberated, and this is the reason why the termination of the process of dependent origination is also considered the way to make an end of suffering in life as well.